As heiress to the Duchy of Aquitaine in western France, she brought this domain into the marriage, thereby augmenting the territories governed by Henry to encompass a substantial portion of northern and western France, in addition to England and Wales. The dynasty into which Richard was born is known to posterity as the Plantagenets, deriving their name from a sprig of broom blossom of the Planta genista variety, which Henry II's father was accustomed to wear. This lineage now held sway over extensive lands straddling both sides of the English Channel, and Richard's life would be characterized by his navigation of these dual spheres, wherein the Plantagenets functioned as both the royal family of England and a prominent noble house within France. Richard's early life conformed to the pattern typical of a family governing a highly disparate dominion. King Henry II reigned as King of England and Lord of Wales, mirroring the enduring historical association between England and Wales that persists to this day. However, the Plantagenet realms extended considerably further. As a descendant of William the Conqueror, Henry exercised authority over the Duchy of Normandy in northern France, alongside several other territories in northern and western France, such as the County of Maine. Moreover, as previously noted, his union with Eleanor had integrated the Duchy of Aquitaine into the Plantagenet sphere of influence. Consequently, Henry's dominions were nearly comparable in scale to those of the French monarchy within France, with the French kings ruling the southern and eastern regions of the country from Paris. However, owing to the intricacies of France's territorial subdivisions, the kings of England were nominally vassals of the French kings, pledging fealty to them in their capacity as Dukes of Normandy, even while concurrently contesting the French crown for political and military supremacy throughout France. In addition to these continental holdings, Henry II also oversaw the establishment of a nascent English lordship across the Irish Sea during Richard's formative years. Thus, the entity known as the Angevin Empire encompassed England, Wales, Ireland, and the majority of northern and central France. This multifaceted territory was destined to come under Richard's rule in due course. During his youth, many would not have entertained the notion that young Richard would one day ascend to the kingship, as he had an elder brother named Henry after the king himself, in addition to two younger brothers, Geoffrey and John, and three sisters, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan, each of whom would exert a significant influence upon Richard's life at various junctures. As was customary for the era, the upbringing of Richard and his siblings fell under the purview of his mother. A substantial portion of this responsibility was delegated to a nurse named Hodierna, to whom Richard later bestowed a considerable pension in recognition of her services. Consistent with the conventions of the time, limited concrete evidence is extant pertaining to Richard's youth and education. However, it is known that he would have received a conventional education befitting a royal son, primarily focused upon the arts of warfare. Nonetheless, his education also encompassed a sufficiently broad literary component, enabling him later in life to read and converse in Latin with considerable proficiency, while he also demonstrably harbored a keen interest in poetry and music. Furthermore, several Muslim chroniclers would subsequently attest to his fascination with Arab culture, although it remains uncertain whether this reflected prior learning on his part or was merely attributed to the English king by Muslim authors as a means of suggesting his possession of notable cultural tolerance. Richard's adult life became overwhelmingly intertwined with France rather than England, and this association commenced early in his life. In June 1172, he was formally invested as the Duke of Aquitaine at the tender age of 14. A year later, he became entangled in the first of several internecine conflicts within the Plantagenet dynasty, as Eleanor and her sons allied themselves with King Louis VII of France against their own father. During this rebellion, Richard was actually knighted by King Louis, and in the summer of 1173, he experienced his initial significant military engagement in Normandy. Mere weeks thereafter, his father offered Richard full possession of several major castles in France, along with half of the revenues derived from Aquitaine, a duchy to which he had nominally succeeded just the year prior. Terms were extended to the sons, but Eleanor would effectively remain her husband's captive for years to come, serving as a deterrent against further familial discord. Henry II was demonstrably impressed by his second eldest son's conduct during the war. In an era where familial rivalries escalating into open rebellion were not entirely uncommon, the king would not necessarily have interpreted his son's revolt as an irreparable breach within the family. Consequently, in the aftermath of the rebellion, Henry granted Richard full command of a segment of the armed forces of the Duchy of Aquitaine, tasking him with subduing any insurgent elements that might emerge within the region. This marked the commencement of Richard's genuine experience of authority and governance, which he would exercise from 1175 through the late 1180s. A substantial portion of this undertaking involved suppressing any inclinations towards independence among the nobility of Western and Central France, most notably Aymar, the Viscount of Limoges, and Guillaume, the Count of Angoulême, both of whom exhibited tendencies to challenge Plantagenet dominance in the region. In 1176 and 1177, these military campaigns extended as far south as the borders of Navarre, a small Basque kingdom situated across the Pyrenees, encompassing territories in both France and Spain. Consequently, Richard began to cultivate his reputation for military prowess at a remarkably young age, still shy of his 20th birthday when he undertook these campaigns. It was this martial aptitude that would later earn him the epithet Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, a sobriquet that gained widespread currency by the mid to late 1180s. Extensive insights into the character of the individual emerging during this period are gleaned from various chronicles authored by contemporary or near-contemporary historians and writers, such as Ralph of Coggeshall and Benedict of Peterborough. Richard was demonstrably exceptionally tall by the standards of the 12th century, exceeding 6 feet in height. He possessed handsome features, characterized by reddish blonde hair and a fair complexion. He was reputed to possess a temperament that prized military achievement, and he cultivated an image of himself as a formidable warrior, a patron of troubadours and poets, yet also someone prone to arrogance and avarice, and occasionally quick to anger. He married later in life, following protracted negotiations for his union with Berengaria, eldest daughter of Sancho VI of Navarre. Although the marriage would remain childless, this absence of offspring, coupled with certain contemporary allusions to Richard's sexuality, has prompted 20th century historians to speculate whether Richard may have been homosexual and whether this accounted for his failure to produce heirs with Berengaria. However, this matter remains open to scholarly debate, as the available sources are ambiguous, leading other historians to posit that he may have been bisexual. The late 1170s and early 1180s witnessed a strengthening of Richard's relationship with his father, despite the earlier rebellion. In 1176 and 1177, he campaigned as far afield as northern Spain, with the aim of reinforcing the Angevin Empire's southern frontiers in Aquitaine. Simultaneously, his actions could often prove excessively forceful, and numerous accounts exist of his suppression of local uprisings, particularly the demolition of castles belonging to those whose loyalties were questioned, leading to widespread resentment and unrest. As a contemporary poet, Bertrand de Born, observed, "He besieges and pursues them, takes their castles and smashes and burns in every direction." Even within an era that valorized warlike conduct among its rulers, there is an implication here that young Richard the Lionheart's methods were unduly harsh. Resentment towards this brutal suppression of any perceived dissent notably culminated in the outbreak of a significant rebellion within Gascony in southwestern France during the late 1170s and early 1180s, and in the Limousin region of central France. Richard persisted in quelling these instances of unrest, although the extent to which he himself bore responsibility for their instigation through his heavy-handed governance of Aquitaine remains debatable, given the tendency of later chroniclers to portray his actions in an overly favorable light. Underpinning all of this activity during the late 1170s and early 1180s was persistent familial discord among Richard, his brothers, and their father, exacerbated by Henry II's ongoing imprisonment of their mother, Eleanor. Much of this tension increasingly centered upon the issue of succession. As Henry II approached his 50th year, an age that would have been considered the onset of advanced age during the 12th century, while Henry, his eldest son, was designated heir apparent according to the principle of primogeniture, the geographically dispersed nature of the Angevin Empire, coupled with the antagonistic relationship between Henry and his sons, ensured considerable ambiguity regarding the succession, specifically who would inherit which portions of Henry's vast dominions, and perpetual tension as a result. Richard, for instance, demonstrably harbored ambitions to secure Aquitaine for himself, independent of his elder brother's authority. This simmering conflict reached a boiling point in the winter of 1182, when King Henry requested Richard to pledge homage to his elder brother Henry. This act of fealty would have obligated Richard to acknowledge Henry's future authority over the Duchy of Aquitaine, whereas Richard was clearly striving to have the duchy separated from the broader Angevin Empire, transforming it into his own independent fiefdom upon his father's death. On June 11th of that summer, Henry II's eldest surviving son and namesake, sometimes referred to as Henry the Young King, succumbed to dysentery while, yet again, in rebellion against his father in central France. Richard now became his father's eldest surviving son and the new heir apparent to the Angevin territories encompassing England, Wales, Ireland, and a substantial portion of France. Superficially, the reduced number of sons might have been expected to stabilize familial relations, particularly when the king's third son, Geoffrey, also died in 1186 under somewhat unclear circumstances surrounding a jousting tournament. Yet these deaths did not quell the Plantagenet family squabbles, and in the ensuing years, the king began to increasingly favor his younger son John, especially following Geoffrey's demise. Henry now desired that John should inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine, while Richard would receive the remainder of his father's territories. Conversely, Richard proved unwilling to accede to his father's wishes in this regard, particularly as his long-standing association with Aquitaine had fostered a profound personal attachment to the duchy. It was thus in an endeavor to compel his father's hand on this matter that Richard formed an alliance with the French King Philip II in 1187. This would prove to be the final instance of rebellion between Henry and one of his sons. The insurgency of 1187 unfolded with rapidity. Philip II had ascended to the French throne in 1180 at the young age of 15. At a concluding conference, Henry appeared visibly unwell and is believed to have cursed Richard. He died mere days afterward on July 6, 1189, leaving Richard as his undisputed successor. The newly ascended king acted with alacrity to secure his patrimony. He was invested as Duke of Normandy a fortnight later, on July 20th. Subsequently, during that summer, he made one of his infrequent, fleeting visits to England, where he was crowned king on September 3, 1189. Finally, following over 15 years of internal strife, the political equilibrium of the Angevin Empire appeared to be stabilizing. Richard had only his brother John remaining as a potential rival. John might have presented a limited threat, but now, at the very zenith of his triumph, Richard was preparing to embark upon a new and distant undertaking. A summons had reached him from the Crusader states of the Holy Land. The Crusades constituted an ongoing series of conflicts in which European Christians had been engaged since the late 11th century, aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land, encompassing Palestine and Syria, and especially Jerusalem, for Christendom. For centuries following the ascendance of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Holy Land had remained under Christian dominion, specifically as an integral part of the Byzantine Empire. However, during the 7th century, these territories were swiftly overrun and conquered by Arab forces, becoming assimilated into their caliphate, which was subsequently governed from Baghdad. Yet, while the loss of the holy places associated with Jesus and his disciples represented a setback for Christian Europe, its impact was mitigated by the general tolerance exhibited by the Muslim rulers, who permitted Christian pilgrims from Europe to visit the Holy Land with relative freedom. However, during the course of the 11th century, this equilibrium shifted as the Seljuk Turks, an aggressively expansionist people originating from Central Asia, conquered a substantial portion of the Middle East, posing a threat to the Byzantine Empire's capital at Constantinople and curtailing access for Christians to the Holy Land. In response, the Byzantine imperial administration appealed to the Christian powers of Western Europe for assistance against the Turks. The ensuing response precipitated 2 centuries of crusading activity, spanning from the 1090s to the 1290s. In 1095, Pope Urban II initially proclaimed the imperative for a crusade aimed at reclaiming the Holy Land for Christianity. This pronouncement elicited a highly enthusiastic reaction, and tens of thousands assumed the Crusader cross and journeyed eastward, including numerous senior nobles from France, England, and Germany. By 1099, this first crusade had culminated in the conquest of the Holy Land and the establishment of several Crusader states, including a newly founded Kingdom of Jerusalem. These kingdoms and principalities prospered for decades until a Muslim army reconquered the city of Edessa in 1144, thereby triggering a second crusade between 1147 and 1150. Although King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany journeyed eastward on this occasion, the Second Crusade met with limited success. A period of relative calm ensued for several years thereafter. But in the 1170s and early 1180s, a new Muslim leader from Kurdistan succeeded in unifying the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, thereby encircling the Crusader kingdoms. Richard had already resolved to journey to the Holy Land on crusade as early as 1187, as news of Saladin's triumph at the Battle of Hattin had begun to filter into Europe. In the ensuing months, King Philip of France, and indeed King Henry II, prior to his death, had committed to undertaking similar expeditions. These actions were not atypical for prominent European monarchs and lords, who sought to project an image of commitment to the crusading ideal. However, in this particular instance, the Western European monarchs were genuinely dedicated to this endeavor, and Richard remained steadfast in his resolve to embark upon his quest to the Middle East following his accession as king. Consequently, preparations for departure were set in motion throughout the summer and autumn of 1189 and into the winter months. The primary objective at this juncture was to amass sufficient financial resources for the undertaking, an initiative that would necessitate a substantial fleet to transport troops across the Mediterranean, alongside extensive logistical support over a period of several years. A tithe or 10% tax was levied specifically for this purpose, to finance the crusade. It became known as the Saladin tithe, and its implementation had been initiated by Henry II before his death. Concurrently, the ecclesiastical hierarchy of England and of the various Angevin territories in Wales, Ireland, and France were compelled to contribute thousands of pounds in funding towards the Third Crusade, to which Richard was now committed to embarking in 1190. Certain final preparations remained to be completed in both England and France before Richard could depart. The paramount objective here was to establish individuals in positions of authority within the regions, particularly the various duchies and counties under his control in France, who would effectively sustain Richard's rule during what was anticipated to be a protracted absence in the Holy Land. Thus, William Fitzralph, a loyal stalwart of Henry II's administration, and one who had demonstrated considerable allegiance to Richard since his ascension, was confirmed as Seneschal of the Duchy of Normandy, effectively functioning as the governor of the extensive territory of northern France. Pan de Rochefort was designated as his counterpart, appointed Seneschal of Anjou in western France. However, the most significant appointment was that of William de Longchamp, the Lord Chancellor of England, as the head of the government there during Richard's absence. This appointment served as a pointed rebuke to Richard's brother John, who might have harbored aspirations for a more prominent role in the governance of his brother's dominions during his absence. John's ensuing dissatisfaction with this arrangement would precipitate several years of unrest during Richard's absence, during which John would persistently seek to undermine his brother's authority, principally through attempts to usurp his position as king in England, Normandy, and elsewhere. Following months of meticulous preparations, the crusade was finally poised for departure by the summer of 1190. In its nascent stages, the expedition would be effectively co-led by Richard and the French king, Philip II. The two monarchs departed from Vézelay in central France together on July 4, 1190. They parted ways at Lyon, with Philip leading his contingents overland across the Alps via Italy, while Richard elected to proceed to Marseille, intending to embark by sea along the Italian coastline towards Sicily from the southern French port. Considerable delays were encountered during these journeys as a substantial portion of the fleet dispatched from England and western France, sailing around the Iberian Peninsula, had experienced delays in entering the Mediterranean Sea. Notably, a drunken episode involving the soldiers while in Lisbon, Portugal, had particularly hampered progress, necessitating Richard to hire additional vessels at Marseille to dispatch a significant portion of his forces to the Holy Land ahead of his own contingent. Richard then undertook an extended tour of the Italian coastline, visiting locations such as the medical school of Salerno, a journey that evidenced Richard's engagement with the burgeoning intellectual currents of the 12th century Renaissance that was unfolding in Italy. He finally reached Messina in Sicily on September 23, 1190. Here, Richard conferred with Philip before the French monarch swiftly departed for the Holy Land. Richard, however, had pressing matters to address in Sicily before his own departure. In 1177, Richard's sister Joan had been wed to King William II of Sicily, known as William the Good. William had died in November 1189, and the crown was promptly usurped by an illegitimate claimant named Tancred. This Tancred then imprisoned Joan, fearing she might become a focal point of resistance to his rule. Upon arriving in Sicily, Richard swiftly secured her release, but unresolved issues persisted concerning Joan's dowry and valuable household silver. Tensions rapidly escalated in late September and early October, culminating in Richard ordering his troops to fully disembark from their ships by October 2nd, preparing for potential armed conflict. When skirmishes erupted between Richard's forces and Tancred's troops 2 days later, Richard ordered an assault on the city of Messina, an attack that quickly proved successful. Peace terms were agreed upon on October 6th, with Tancred agreeing to pay a substantial sum of money to Richard and a formal alliance being established between the two rulers. Richard's Crusader army ultimately departed Italy on April 10, 1191, comprising a formidable armada of over 200 ships and 17,000 soldiers and mariners. The fleet soon encountered adversity, but these initial setbacks would ultimately prove remarkably fortuitous. On the third day of their voyage from Sicily, a violent storm scattered the fleet, and by the time the ships reconvened near the large Greek island of Crete, it became evident that numerous vessels had either been lost or had strayed from their designated course. Among the missing ships was one of the royal vessels transporting Richard's intended bride, Berengaria, and his sister Joan. This particular ship could not simply be abandoned, and a comprehensive search throughout the eastern Mediterranean was initiated to locate it. It was eventually discovered anchored in the port of Limassol on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus had long been a possession of the Eastern Byzantine Empire, governed by Isaac Ducas Komnenos. Komnenos had recently developed delusions of grandeur, proclaiming himself Emperor of Cyprus, independent of Constantinople. Now in the summer of 1191, he seized several of the scattered Crusader vessels and was contemplating similar action against the ship carrying Joan and Berengaria. This action would prove to be a fateful miscalculation. In early May, Richard arrived in Cyprus. When the self-proclaimed Emperor Komnenos refused to release the captured ships and prisoners, Richard opted for immediate military intervention, launching an assault on the city of Limassol. A surprise nocturnal attack swiftly led to the complete capture of the capital. Although the emperor managed to escape, this effectively deprived him of his treasury and military resources. In the ensuing weeks, further pockets of resistance were systematically eliminated, and Cyprus was brought under Crusader control. A substantial portion of this conquest was achieved through Richard's coordination with the leaders of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Guy de Lusignan, a prominent Crusader leader, having received news of the events unfolding in Cyprus, arrived with several contingents of seasoned Crusader warriors. De Lusignan held the nominal title of King of Jerusalem, although his kingdom lacked its capital city, which had fallen to Saladin years prior. His claim to primacy among the Crusader states' nobility was contested, notably by Conrad de Montferrat, another claimant to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Guy and Conrad, alongside Richard and Saladin, would emerge as pivotal figures in the unfolding events in the Holy Land. By early June, Richard had secured control over Cyprus, a prosperous island nation with significant trade connections, poised to become a vital Crusader base for years to come. More broadly, Cyprus transitioned into an autonomous Christian kingdom, governed by the Lusignan dynasty for generations and remaining independent until the late 15th century. Its conquest arguably represents the most concrete achievement of Richard's entire crusade. The capture of Cyprus and the subsequent summer sojourn there in 1191 also afforded Richard the opportunity to finally marry Berengaria. The wedding took place on May 12, 1191 at the Chapel of St. George in Limassol. The marriage was strategically intended to unite Navarre and the Duchy of Aquitaine, incorporating them into the broader Angevin Empire in the long term, a plan that ultimately proved elusive. Richard and Berengaria remained childless and emotionally distant. Some historians even question whether their marriage was ever consummated. Nevertheless, the union was celebrated with considerable pomp and ceremony throughout Cyprus in the early summer of 1191. These events collectively hinted at significant success for Richard upon his eventual arrival in the Holy Land. A substantial kingdom had already been secured for the Crusaders, and their new leader arrived as a victorious warrior, newlywed. However, reality proved more nuanced. Richard finally disembarked near Acre on June 8, 1191, over a year after his and King Philip's initial departure from France for the Crusade. Crusader forces had been engaged in a siege of Acre, a crucial city in the Holy Land. present-day northern Israel, since 1189. This siege marked the Crusaders' first major counteroffensive following their defeat by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the subsequent loss of Jerusalem. The siege's initial momentum was largely driven by Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and Conrad de Montferrat, his principal rival for dominance among the Crusader nobility. They had been joined in April by the King of France. With Richard's additional forces bolstering their efforts, the siege finally became insurmountable for the Arab defenders. On July 4th, they surrendered. Terms were negotiated in the ensuing days, granting safe passage to a significant portion of the Arab garrison in exchange for a substantial ransom and the provision of prisoners as collateral for its payment. The siege's conclusion also precipitated Philip's decision to return to France. Having narrowly survived dysentery outside Acre, he opted to return to Western Europe ahead of Richard. This allowed him to actively undermine Richard's position while his rival remained absent in the Holy Land, far from France. Richard now stood as the undisputed leader of the Third Crusade, yet he had not yet directly confronted Saladin on the battlefield. This confrontation was imminent as Richard continued his campaign to secure the Palestinian coastline. His aim was to solidify the Crusader foothold and establish a secure base for a renewed offensive to recapture Jerusalem. Richard was clearly deeply involved in this decision. However, the extent to which this action violated the laws of war as understood in the late 12th century remains a subject of considerable debate even today. With this matter concluded, Richard led his army southward towards Jaffa on August 22nd. His forces remained close to the coast, ensuring reinforcement from the Crusader fleet and its extensive resources in the eastern Mediterranean. This southward movement ultimately led to Richard's battlefield encounter with Saladin, marking the most significant direct clash between the two leaders of the Third Crusade. The Battle of Arsuf took place on September 7th en route to Jaffa. For days, Saladin, commanding a force of approximately 25,000 men, primarily light cavalry, had harassed Richard's numerically smaller but better equipped and trained army. Richard's force comprised roughly 10,000 infantry and over 1,700 heavily armored cavalry. The latter constituted the elite fighting force in the Holy Land during the Crusades. However, they lacked the maneuverability of Saladin's light cavalry, a disadvantage compounded by Richard's reluctance to stray far from his baggage trains and risk jeopardizing water supplies, a critical factor in the Crusader defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. When a full-scale battle finally erupted on September 7th, Saladin's troops initially breached the Crusader formation. However, a counterattack led by Richard in the afternoon galvanized the Christian lines. Gaps opened in their infantry ranks, allowing the heavy cavalry to surge forward and strike at the more vulnerable light cavalry. Following three such charges, the Arab armies were routed, fleeing into the adjacent hills and forests. Contemporary accounts of casualties are wildly inflated, but estimates suggest that Saladin's losses reached 5,000 to 6,000 men, compared to fewer than 1,000 for Richard. Arsuf stands as Richard's most significant battlefield victory during the Third Crusade. It cleared the path to Jaffa, which the Crusaders reached 3 days later. Acting on Saladin's orders, the city walls had been dismantled, effectively ceding Jaffa to the Christians. However, this also necessitated Richard spending weeks rebuilding makeshift fortifications to secure the town for the Crusaders. It was during this time that Richard began to consider that the key to securing the Holy Land might lie in targeting Saladin's core territories in Egypt, particularly by seizing Cairo. This strategy, targeting Egypt, would gain widespread acceptance as the optimal approach for the Crusaders many years later in the 13th century. However, Richard was overruled for the time being by Guy, Conrad, and his fellow Crusaders, who favored a direct assault on Jerusalem. Consequently, the early winter was spent capturing and garrisoning several castles along the inland route from Jaffa to Jerusalem. By the close of 1191, Richard's crusade had achieved the conquest of Cyprus for Christendom and the recapture of the Palestinian coast from Acre to Jaffa. The route to Jerusalem was now being prepared for an advance on the Holy City. However, this Jerusalem campaign would never materialize under Richard's leadership. Early in 1192, Richard's direct involvement in the Crusades began to inexorably diminish. On January 20th, 1192, he reached Ascalon, where plans were initiated to refortify the site. Ascalon was envisioned as a base from which to disrupt Muslim caravans traversing the Holy Land between Syria and Egypt. Yet disagreements arose among the Crusader leadership regarding funding for this endeavor. prompting Richard to withdraw to Acre. Further disputes then erupted in Acre between Crusader contingents, particularly the merchants representing major Italian trading powers, upon whose finances and supplies the Crusader states heavily relied, concerning future strategy. By late spring, Richard increasingly recognized the futility of attempting to unite the disparate leaders and factions involved in concerted action. Adding to these challenges, while at Acre, he received unsettling news from Western Europe. Fresh unrest had erupted in his own domains. His brother John was now openly conspiring with the French monarchy. Richard's continued presence on crusade in the Holy Land threatened his hold on the Angevin Empire back home. These combined factors led him, in the spring of 1192, to decide to return home, foregoing the ultimate prize of Jerusalem. Several matters still required resolution in the Holy Land before Richard could depart. Foremost among these was the issue of crusade leadership following the English king's departure. Would Guy of Lusignan, the recognized king of Jerusalem, or Conrad de Montferrat, his challenger, succeed Richard as the leading figure? In an attempt to resolve this, Richard convened a council, attempting to install Conrad as the new head of the Crusader states. In exchange, Richard sold Cyprus to Guy for 60,000 byzants. However, this arrangement was barely finalized when Conrad was assassinated by two individuals in late April. The identity of those who commissioned the assassination remains unclear to this day, with suspicions falling on everyone from Richard to Saladin for various reasons. What is evident is that Conrad's death plunged affairs into further chaos. Then Saladin's recapture of Jaffa at the end of July, before Richard himself could relieve the siege, solidified Richard's decision to leave the Holy Land. On September the 2nd, a 3-year truce was agreed upon between Richard and his formidable adversary. Richard's journey back to Europe was not straightforward. By November 1192, he had reached the Greek island of Corfu. At this point, he chose to travel back to Western Europe via Germany rather than westward through Italy. Richard was acutely aware that he was traversing territories ruled by several principalities hostile to him, notably that of Leopold of Austria. Leopold, a staunch ally of Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor and aspiring leader of future Crusades, regarded Richard as an enemy. Knowing that passing through Leopold's lands risked capture by Henry, Richard hired several galleys at Corfu and sailed north, accompanied by a small retinue of his most trusted followers. He hoped to evade detection by posing as pilgrims returning from the Holy Land. However, this ruse proved ineffective. Their ships wrecked on the Istrian coastline. While proceeding towards Moravia and Austria, their party aroused suspicion. Consequently, they were apprehended near Vienna while crossing Leopold's territory in December 1192. Within days, news reached Emperor Henry that King Richard of England had been captured and was being held by Leopold in Dürnstein Castle, northwest of Vienna. The emperor had multiple motives for detaining Richard. Henry was also loosely allied with King Philip of France. Accordingly, the emperor corresponded with Philip within days, informing the French king of the welcome news of the English king's capture. Back in England, John also learned of his brother's imprisonment and paid homage to Philip, seeking to reinforce his own claim to succeed Richard. However, church authorities, who maintained that all crusaders were immune from attack or imprisonment while traveling to or from the Holy Land on crusade, were less pleased. They brought significant pressure to bear on Leopold and Henry to release Richard. Subsequently, weeks of protracted negotiations ensued to determine the terms of Richard's release from his German captors. Finally, in late February 1193, terms were agreed upon in Speyer. Richard successfully defended himself against fabricated accusations of abandoning the crusade. Nevertheless, Richard was still compelled to pay a ransom of 100,000 marks and pledged to furnish the emperor with 50 galleys and the annual service of 200 knights, resources Henry would utilize to launch his own crusade in subsequent years. Further negotiations regarding these stipulations ensued, delaying Richard's departure from Germany until early 1194, well over a year after his initial exit from the Holy Land. Richard then commenced the final leg of his homeward journey. Not all developments during his absence had been detrimental to his standing relative to John. In 1192, King Philip had incited a rebellion within the Duchy of Aquitaine. However, this event served to demonstrate the strength of Richard's alliances. On this occasion, Berengaria's brother, Sancho of Navarre, intervened from the south in the Basque region during Richard's absence to quell the uprising. Indeed, Sancho went further, launching a punitive raid against Toulouse to underscore that Richard's French holdings were not undefended targets during his absence in the Holy Land or his journey home. Furthermore, back in England, numerous senior officials who had remained loyal to Richard prior to his crusade departure continued to do so. They diligently worked to frustrate John's attempts to undermine his brother's authority. Nevertheless, other developments did not bode favorably for Richard. In April 1193, King Philip finally inflicted a significant setback upon Richard's cause by seizing Gisors in Normandy. This capture was possibly facilitated by the Castellan, a high-ranking official there, who may have been willing to surrender, anticipating John's imminent succession to Richard as Duke of Normandy. All of these circumstances indicated ongoing instability as Richard returned to Western Europe in early 1194. Richard departed Germany in February 1194, reaching England on March 13th. En route through the Rhineland, he reaffirmed alliances with princes and lords of Western Germany and the Low Countries, encompassing modern-day Belgium. Upon landing in England, resistance to his resumption of royal authority was remarkably limited, perhaps due to John's absence in the Duchy of Normandy. Richard initially visited religious shrines at Canterbury and Bury St. Edmunds before proceeding to the strategically important Nottingham Castle, the supposed epicenter of John's rebellion. Some skirmishes occurred before the castle surrendered on March 28th. Subsequently, Richard resumed the full prerogatives of his English kingship. He presided over multiple government meetings at Winchester before departing for France in early May to directly confront John in Normandy. He entrusted the English government to Hubert Walter, who had accompanied Richard on crusade and had been elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury in 1193. Richard would never set foot in England again, reflecting his perception of France as the core of his dominions, mirroring the view held by his ancestors dating back to William the Conqueror. While England witnessed minimal resistance to Richard's royal restoration and was rapidly stabilized, the Crusader king's return to France proved considerably less seamless. John had entrenched himself in Normandy, relying on a strong alliance with the French king to solidify his position. Consequently, by Richard's arrival in northern France in early summer 1194, John and King Philip had deployed substantial French forces throughout the region, controlling numerous key strategic locations across Normandy and elsewhere. The French king proved to be the more steadfast and dependable of Richard's adversaries. Conversely, no sooner had the English king landed in Normandy than his brother and would-be rival hastily sought forgiveness from Richard. Richard granted this pardon, attributing John's actions to poor counsel from his advisors. For his part, John remained loyal to Richard for the remainder of his brother's reign. Thus, within days of Richard's arrival, the conflict shifted from a pseudo-civil war between Richard and John to a more conventional war between the kings of England and France. In this new phase, Richard was quickly aided by his familial allies from Navarre. By mid-June, Tours in central France had been retaken by Richard's forces. The military campaign then shifted to the Loire River Valley. After a swift series of engagements there, Richard moved south into Aquitaine. By late July, he had captured Taillebourg and Marcillac, along with the city of Angoulême, Montignac, and Lachaise. This largely completed Richard's reconquest of his western French territories, a mere 3 months after his crossing from England to France. However, Richard's reconquest of his French territories proved more transient than initially appeared. His control over Normandy, in particular, remained tenuous. Efforts to fully re-establish his authority over the duchy would dominate much of his subsequent reign. During his southward campaign to regain Aquitaine in the summer of 1194, Richard had left several castles in King Philip's control. Several of these were major strongholds, heavily garrisoned, necessitating extensive and costly sieges to dislodge the French forces. Consequently, a truce was agreed upon in late summer 1194. These locations would remain under French control until winter 1195, with a cessation of hostilities between Richard and Philip's armies. Superficially, this arrangement offered advantages to both monarchs. It afforded Philip time to reassess his strategic position, given the increasingly improbable prospect of completely replacing Richard with John. For Richard, the 15-month truce provided an opportunity to solidify his newly restored rule and effectively address those who had supported John's attempted usurpation. The 1194 truce between Richard and the French king proved short-lived. Within weeks of its agreement, border tensions and skirmishes erupted in various locales across France. By summer 1195, full-scale warfare had effectively resumed. Richard's strategy in this renewed conflict focused on seizing control of the Auvergne and Berry regions in central France, the border region between Richard's French territories and those of the French monarchy. This approach quickly yielded results. By early autumn 1195, Philip indicated a willingness to relinquish control of Richard's territories seized during the king's crusade absence. His offer was contingent upon a marriage alliance between Richard's niece Eleanor and Philip's son and heir Louis. This proposal, however, proved unsuccessful. As fighting persisted, Richard achieved further territorial gains, compelling Philip to agree to a treaty in January 1196. Under the terms of the Treaty of Louviers, Philip ceded all major territorial gains acquired during Richard's absence, with the exceptions of the Vexin region in northwestern France and a few border castles. This treaty brought a degree of resolution to the conflict in central France, although renewed tensions persisted elsewhere in the years ahead. As 1196 progressed, the war between Richard and Philip underwent a dramatic shift. Philip forged a new alliance of powers to counter Richard's rapid ascendance on both sides of the English Channel. This coalition included several prominent lords from the Low Countries, notably the Counts of Flanders, Ponthieu, and Boulogne. They were joined in the North Atlantic by the Duchy of Brittany and northwestern France. This new confederacy now exerted significant pressure on Richard's shipping lanes and logistical networks in the English Channel. To counteract this threat, Richard was compelled to divert substantial land forces to an invasion of Brittany in mid-1196. Yet even this setback proved temporary. Richard ultimately managed to compel Count Baldwin of Flanders to switch allegiances. He achieved this first by initiating a massive embargo on trade and goods supply, and subsequently by offering a favorable alliance of his own. Thus, Baldwin transitioned from blockading Angevin shipping in the Channel to invading Artois in northeastern France on Richard's behalf, capturing the significant French town of Douai. Then, in a remarkable turn of events, a coalition of German princes petitioned Richard to support his nephew Otto, son of Richard's sister Matilda and her husband Henry of Bavaria and Saxony, as a potential successor to the office of Holy Roman Emperor. This constituted an astonishing diplomatic triumph for Richard. While 1197 and 1198 brought further successes for Richard, he would not live to fully enjoy their fruits. In autumn 1198, Richard opted to finalize the reduction of the Vexin, a small county near Paris, from Philip following the expiration of yet another truce with the French king. Facing pressure from the Count of Flanders in the northeast and Richard in the west, Philip twice narrowly escaped capture during the ensuing campaign, including one near-drowning incident. This effectively completed the conquest of the Vexin, restoring to Richard all territories held prior to his departure for the Holy Land and placing him in the most dominant position any English monarch had occupied relative to the French monarchy for decades. In January 1199, King Richard met with his French counterpart, King Philip, at a summit brokered by Pope Innocent III. A 5-year truce was agreed upon, ushering in an unprecedented period of peace and stability for Richard's dominions. Ironically, it was during this period of relative harmony that Richard met his demise, still in his early 40s. On March 26, 1199, he was struck by a crossbow bolt while campaigning to suppress a minor regional revolt led by Viscount Aymar Feude of Limoges. In the days that followed, lacking the benefits of modern medical intervention, the wound became gangrenous. On April 6th, Richard succumbed to the resulting infection. He was subsequently interred at Fontevraud. Richard was succeeded by John, whom Richard had designated as his heir during his final illness. The would-be usurper's accession signaled the end of the conflict with Philip. In 1200, the Treaty of Les Goulets confirmed John's possession of his French territories in exchange for acknowledging Philip as his liege lord in France itself. However, this peace proved ephemeral. In subsequent years, the French crown initiated the reconquest of several key regions of the Angevin Empire from the English monarchy. This marked the beginning of a protracted process that would ultimately continue until the 1550s. Overseas, Richard's crusader endeavors achieved similarly transient success. Further crusades followed in the ensuing years and decades, extending into the late 13th century. Some achieved varying degrees of success, primarily in regions outside the Holy Land. For instance, in 1204, a Christian army captured the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and established a Western Roman Catholic Christian state in the Balkans that endured for decades. Others attempted to seize Egypt, viewing it as the strategic linchpin to the Holy Land, much as Richard had envisioned in 1191. The Sixth Crusade in the late 1220s finally succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, Richard's ultimate, unattainable goal. Nevertheless, this triumph proved fleeting, and within 15 years, the Holy City reverted to Muslim control. Subsequently, the Crusader state's fortunes waned, despite ongoing efforts by major European monarchs to launch new campaigns aimed at reclaiming the holy sites for Christendom. With the fall of Tripoli in 1289 and the siege of Acre in 1291, a century after Richard's arrival there in 1191, the Crusader cause in the Holy Land was extinguished. However, it was in no small measure due to Richard's efforts that these Christian kingdoms endured as long as they did. Richard the Lionheart stands as one of England's most celebrated kings, a somewhat curious phenomenon given the brevity of his reign. He ruled for a mere decade, half of which he spent abroad in Sicily, Cyprus, the Holy Land, and Germany. Yet, it is precisely this period that cemented his reputation and secured his enduring fame. For 2 years in the Mediterranean, Richard spearheaded the Crusader efforts, revitalizing the movement after years of setbacks for the Christian states and repeated defeats by Saladin. It is hardly surprising that Richard captured the popular imagination in this manner, particularly as he presented a formidable counter to the seemingly invincible Muslim commander. Following the stalemate of the Second Crusade in the mid-12th century, Richard was portrayed as the first major Crusader leader to achieve significant conquests and territorial gains in the Holy Land since the First Crusade over 90 years prior. For generations of chroniclers and historians since the late 12th century, this image of the valorous Crusader warrior, dubbed Lionheart for his bravery, was further accentuated by the perceived treachery of his brother John. John, back in Western Europe, was depicted as conspiring with the French to usurp Richard's throne, while the valiant king was absent. However, while this idealized portrayal of Richard forms the bedrock of much of his legacy, there exists considerable grounds for critique regarding the Lionheart. These criticisms have become prominent in historical scholarship on the king in recent decades. Primarily, his reign was dominated by warfare. This pattern had commenced well before his own ascension, with conflicts against his father in the 1170s and 1180s. It persisted through his involvement in the Crusades and abated only marginally upon his return from the Holy Land. He commissioned some castles, again primarily for military purposes, and issued directives for projects to be undertaken in his name upon his departure from England in 1194. However, his reign is conspicuously lacking in any significant initiatives aimed at judicial reform. The introduction of novel taxation systems beyond those financing his military endeavors, or the implementation of any civil governance policies that might have substantially improved the administration of his dominions or the lives of his subjects. Perhaps the most balanced assessment of Richard the Lionheart involves considering both extremes of his reign. While Richard can justifiably be criticized for a life seemingly defined by warfare, such engagement was, after all, largely considered the primary duty and responsibility of a European monarch during the High Middle Ages. Moreover, while it is reasonable to argue that he could have secured peace with France more expeditiously in the mid-1190s, thereby enabling a shift towards addressing taxation and noble rights issues that would plague John's subsequent reign, it is equally pertinent to acknowledge that Richard was responding to aggression initiated by others. The Third Crusade was a direct response to Saladin's conquests in the Holy Land, and Richard's French wars were precipitated by the conspiracies of Philip and John during Richard's absence on crusade. Finally, while Richard has undoubtedly been excessively lionized by historians and chroniclers for centuries following his death, it is equally true that he was the most successful Crusader leader in over 90 years. Upon his arrival, the Crusader states faced imminent collapse in the Holy Land. However, by his departure in 1192, the Christian cause had been revitalized and expanded, ensuring its survival for another century. Perhaps in this regard, his most exaggerated legacy is paradoxically also his most authentic. What are your thoughts on Richard the Lionheart? Does his brief reign represent a major missed opportunity for English kingship, or are his abilities as a monarch overstated? Please share your opinions in the comments section. In the meantime, thank you for watching.